So, in continuing to talk about this idea of the terminology that we use for our church services today, the way we do church, there's another word that we use, and that's the altar. So, usually the front of the sanctuary where the preaching is done and other things right there at the front of the church. Many churches call that an altar. Not every church. I don't think it's as common as it used to be. But still, many churches, whether traditional or even like big mega churches, a lot of times will call the front the altar. And it'll be used for things more modern today to come up and receive prayer. People will come up to the altar to receive prayer, something like that. But I think the origins of the front of a church building being called an altar was where the communion table was, where communion or the Lord's Supper was offered to church members. And so there's this tie-in to the sacrifice that Jesus made. Because what is the origin of the word altar anyway? It comes from the Old Testament sacrifices that were done in the temple or the tabernacle. The altar was the place where you would offer an animal. The animal would be killed, the blood would be spilled, and it would cover the altar. The altar would be a bloody mess. And that was part of temple worship. People would bring their animal sacrifices. The priest would be the one who would do the sacrifices there at the altar. So that's, I think, how the tie-in comes in. But I think it becomes problematic when we carry these terms from the Old Testament to the New. It can cause confusion because we're not offering sacrifices by any means at the front of the church. The altar that was part of the Old Testament law and the temple service or tabernacle service, that is no more. There's been one sacrifice made by Jesus Christ, and that's the end of it. There are no more sacrifices that God has to offer because he made the final one. And then also importantly, there are no sacrifices that we must make as far as rituals. Now, the Bible does talk about us making sacrifices in response to what God has done for us, in response to the sacrifice that Jesus made, that we lay down our lives in response to, not in order to earn anything, but in response to what he did. But having an altar or something named an altar in our church services, I don't think is a great idea. I think it brings confusion, that there's maybe something holy or special about the front of a church building or a church auditorium. And that's just not the case. If we're talking about getting prayer, you can get prayer from a Christian anywhere, at any place, in your living room, in the kitchen. If we're talking about taking communion or the Lord's Supper, that doesn't have to happen in a church, even though it's common, and even common in something that was practiced in the New Testament, that they would do that as a congregation. But it doesn't have to be in a church building. It could be in somebody's home. And we don't need a special place to do that. We also have what we call altar calls today, and that's something fairly new in the last couple hundred years, where people are invited up to the altar to receive salvation. And some people don't like the idea of an altar call because they don't think that people should be invited to respond to a gospel presentation. I think that is silly. Of course, it's proper and good to invite people to receive the Lord. Now, of course, it doesn't need to be at the front of the church building. It can be anywhere. So having an altar call per se isn't necessarily biblical because there is no altar that is needed in order for somebody to come to receive the Lord. You can do that anywhere. But again, just another term that we use where we bring the Old Testament paradigm into the New Testament. And I don't think it's helpful. In fact, I think it's counterproductive because it makes it seem as if there's something holy or special about the church building when that's not the case at all. Our worship is one-to-one with God. We don't have to be in a particular location in order to commune with God or practice the things that Christians ought to practice.